right. Good morning, Catholic YouTube. Brian City, the Immaculata, back with you with another installment of our fun Catholic things to discuss. Today, the fun topic will be whether or not Catholic spirituality is sadistic. Fun stuff, right, guys? First, I do want to tell you something that happened to me last night just because it's amusing and I didn't get a chance to talk to my wife this morning, so nobody else knows about this. But one of the things that I've been promising, I promised a loyal listener to this show a while back that I would tell my conversion story. Now, I've been really hesitant to do it. It's probably been a year ago that I made that promise. I will still make that story available to you all. As a matter of fact, I decided last night was as good a night as any to go ahead and record it. And so I wanted to kind of make it a little bit, more formal than maybe these types of lives that I do where they're impromptu. So I kind of wrote it up just to make sure that I cover all the stuff because I will admit my conversion story is fairly unique. At least I haven't heard anybody that's had a conversion story quite like it. So I've got my initial hesitancy to do it anyways because of the simple fact that I don't really like talking about myself so much. It's maybe if it's just a friend or a group of friends or something and it's like some personal stuff comes out, that's one thing. But to put it out to the world, to the ether world out there, something that's like personal as your own life, it just tends to make me a little bit I'll say wary, right? Because I have two general concerns when it comes to making videos. The first concern that I have is whether or not anybody will watch, right? And the concern there being that I spend time to make something and nobody bothers to watch. And that's a risk that, creators take. I tend to take it a little bit more in terms of those risks because I don't like to cover topics that are the kind of clickbaity topics that seem to gather the kind of views that would accumulate numbers. But the other side of that is what if people do watch? And that's its own, can of worms there. And if I'm telling my own personal life and, I know, like I have benefited personally from people's conversion stories. So if I'm out here telling my personal life story and for whatever reason the arbitrators of the YouTube algorithm decides it picks up and it gets shared and all of a sudden a lot of people are watching it. I just want to make sure that I'm careful in how I present the story. So I had everything set up last night. I was, kind of professional camera and going to record it and edit it and all of those good things. And I'm about 15 minutes into recording it and a gust of wind, a car crash, I don't know what it was, but the power goes out in my home and I'm all of a sudden talking to myself in the dark. So I said, Lord, if you wanted to give me a sign that it's not time for me to record this yet, point taken. I will wait on that. So I will still get around to that. It is very frustrating though to kind of like be prepared and like have mentally prepared myself and then be 15 minutes into the story and then lose it. As any of you creators out there know how frustrating that is. But alas, I will get around to telling it one day. Again, I promise. God willing, and the creek don't rise. In the meantime, today we're going to talk about Catholic spirituality. And I see this one come up from time to time. And I've just decided that I wanted to spend a little bit of time with it. I think the Latin Catholic expressions are highly misunderstood, and I haven't seen the most effective or useful discussions around it in the Catholic circles that I've been involved in over the years. I will say my first introduction to these things as a neophyte catechumen all those years ago was hearing old ladies telling others to offer it up, offer it up, offer it up. I heard this all the time. And I was kind of struck by that. You don't hear something like that out in the so-called real world. It's one of these uniquely Catholic sayings. But me being me, I pressed a few of the ladies, what exactly does that mean? Like, offer what? Offer why? And granted, they were kind of able to give their best Baltimore Catechism answers that they had memorized from childhood, and the answers weren't correct. They just left a bit to be desired. These ladies couldn't just explain it adequately with the nuances that's required for these type of things. And I think it's because of this general tendency of maybe some Catholics to lack the appropriate language or the sort of potentially complex things that could arise from the subject of the Latin expression of Catholic spirituality, that all of these further misunderstandings and accusations against our spirituality come from. So we'll get into that. I also want to get into some of the nuances of the practices themselves and the complaints of those from the detractors. Protestant criticisms you'll find are fairly straightforward. We'll mention them, but for the most part, I feel like Protestant objections have been fairly well addressed online. It really, for them, comes down to a matter of the process of justification as it relates to sanctification. If you're justified, then much of Catholic spirituality to a Protestant looks like a works-based faith system. So that's I feel like that's been kind of beaten to the ground. There's a secular argument out there, though, making the rounds that, in my mind, is actually a little bit more nefarious. And this is that what we teach is actually an abusive thing. And this is something that today I want to explore a little bit deeper, because secular arguments largely coming from the weaponized realm of, psychoanalysis, developing out of Freud and some of the, what is his name? It's going to come to me now. He was a famous psychologist and sociologist, Augustus Comte, and some of these thinkers, all the way up to the modern therapy beliefs, holds the position that suffering to today, right? This is where this is all led to. Suffering in any degree is a condition to be eradicated, even to the point of self-deletion in some circumstances were the patient and provider to deem such a thing necessary, all under the guise there of having compassion and care for the subject. And I'm sure many of you probably saw that atrocious clip that was making the rounds online of the Canadian doctor being interviewed by a British lady who was an advocate, I believe, for special needs people. And this doctor, this clearly demonically oppressed woman, talking about how she had murdered 400 of her patients, was sort of an impetus actually for me to go ahead and have this conversation. Now, as a matter of fact, I think I had this thing planned before I saw that clip. It was just sort of providential that that clip was making the rounds as I was getting ready for this. But it ties right into what I wanted to talk about today, right? If that's your ideology, that all suffering is a barnacle to be scraped from the body, from the mind, from the spirit, in so much as they even accept spirit. If that is the case, then imagine hearing Catholics over here telling you that your suffering can actually benefit from you. Of course, they would want to stop that, right? They would want to put the brakes on the Catholic spirituality as something that is abusive and not conformative to the DSM and the standard practices of treating people. Granted, that woman was on the farther side of the spectrum, this doctor. She's Canadian after all. I only have kid there. I love my Canadian friends. Those of you keep watching, don't unsubscribe. But man, you guys, and you know it, I'm sure you know it yourself. You have some nihilist freaks running your healthcare system. The sheer level of let me say it this way, the sheer lack of self-awareness of this woman's gestures and her gesticulations towards talking so nonchalantly with the lady that was interviewing her was saying, look, I'm an advocate. I mean, excuse me, I am a potential candidate for the type of treatment that you are suggesting for people. And it's a slippery slope between my consent, quote unquote, consenting to self deletion versus the state deciding that I am no longer a viable person and being forced into something like this. But even reeling it in, right? I saw a talk maybe a year ago on YouTube. I think it was a mom and a daughter, I believe, two Catholics. The mom was a revert, if I remember right, and they were discussing this issue of deconstructing their Catholic upbringing and having to relearn the faith because they felt that the Western emphasis on suffering was unhealthy. And I remember them specifically talking about St. Francis referring to his body as Brother S, and how he potentially changed his language later in life as a sign that that was actually something that he came to regret. This what would I say, this self image of his body as Brother S was something that Francis in later life would come to regret. Now, I think these two ladies meant well. The problem is that it seems that they have bought the theory of modern therapy, hook, line, and sinker, that human happiness is measured in the attainment of feeling good about oneself. But as you can imagine where I am going, that is clearly a slippery slope they are walking. Taken to its logical ends, it leads eventually to situations like the May doctors in Canada justifying euthanasia. And I know that's not what these two women meant, and I don't mean to imply that in what they were saying, but we have to deal with the reality of our tradition and not just try to hand wave away or say that, St. Francis really didn't mean Brother S when he was talking about his body, or he came to regret it later and refuted his earlier thinking on this. Think about Francis for a moment, if that were the case. Francis, later in his life, towards the end of his life, becomes so conformed to Christ that his body began to display the wounds of Christ. And there's a potent message in this for us. We kind of blithely throw it out there like, oh, yeah, Francis was a stigmatist, but consider the wounds of Christ. This is blood, this is pain. When many of you are thinking of conformity to Christ, you don't necessarily have the blood of Christ and his pain and his discomfort and the passion as the first thing that comes to your mind. But a potent part of the story is that while many are stuck living a life that seeks mortification, the Lord transformed Francis by way of this transformative miracle. The flagellants of later centuries would walk around their villages whipping their own backs in hope of conforming their bodies to the body of Christ. All Francis had to do was live the life that he was living. Granted, St. Francis of Assisi was a very special man, maybe the most holiest man to ever live next to Christ himself and John the Baptist. But there are a lot of people who look at these mortifications aghast at Catholics, like our entire spiritual aesthetic is built on making people harm themselves, both mentally and physically. Where modern people think psychologists and therapists help people unpack unhealthy coping mechanisms and encourage people to leave unhealthy communities that worsen their stress and anxiety. Here we have Catholics and priests telling people to hate themselves, to think of their body as an ass, and cope by bloodletting. But I think there's a certain falsity that many people presume when they're looking at these things superficially. First, I want to say Catholic monks many centuries ago were noticing certain unhealthy psychological traits that people had and were recommending both spiritual and mental solutions. So this whole idea that there is no awareness within the Catholic spiritual realm of a psychosymptomatic somatic manifestations of problems that aren't necessarily spiritual in origin were being recognized. And if you take something like acedia, I've heard it pronounced several different ways, Acedia, also called the noonday devil, also translated sometimes as sloth. This is actually more appropriately, though, than sloth, thought of as a kind of manic depression, is what they used to call it. Acedia could actually manifest itself as hyperactivity. And monks were writing about this in the 4th century, and they weren't necessarily attributing it to demonic activity, though the demons could take this thing that is naturally manifesting in the human body and exacerbate it and make it worse. That was clearly something that was potentially happening. We know about it because it is a lack of joy. Now, keep in mind, it's not happiness, mind you, but that saintly joy. And I actually find the remedies that the monks would apply for these spiritual, mental, physical manifestations to actually be quite mild. There was a book called The Noonday Devil that actually discusses the treating the spiritual ailments of acedia. That's a good book. I would recommend that. But look, when it comes to our minds, the elevated exemplars, the greats, the saints, these are people that have reached certain perfections, certain transformative steps along the path of the spiritual journey. The flagellants, mind you, were condemned. So the church does not carte blanche endorse a free for all self mortification. And in many respects, if you feel that you are called to self mortify, there's a good chance that you are not, at least not to the degree of a Francis or a Catherine of Siena. Mortification actually works on something of a spiritual sliding scale, in my opinion. Lower forms of fasting are greater for those of us that are less up that ladder, which is the vast majority of us, mind you, like me, like you. These type of mortifications include things like fasting, almsgiving, extended time spent in prayer. These are the direct recommendations from one of the great spiritual manuals of all times by Lorenzo Scopoli in his wonderful work in Spiritual Combat. Whereas if you are lower down on the ladder, to try to exponentially increase self mortification as some type of attempt to artificially elevate yourself spiritually, you could end up doing much more damage and deterring that what those small steps, what those little flowers, as St. Therese of Lisieux would say, would actually lead for most of us. And to begin with any of this, the path to sanctification in many respects requires direction. And that's not a question. I think my opinion is for the majority of us, we need superiors that we are obedient to that will become our channels on the guide to what level of self mortification is required of us, because there is a sense in which all of us are required to self mortify. But some directors, under the pain of obedience, will refuse mortification if they believe that you or I, the subject, is being prideful over it, is in any ways that it would be detrimental to us. Open your Scopoli, and I am actually, I don't know if you guys can hear that, but the phone's going. I apologize for that. I am actually sad to say that in my process of moving, I packed up my Spiritual Combat. It's usually on the top shelf. I've got a bunch of books in storage still at the moment, and for whatever reason, I didn't unpack Spiritual Combat. So I don't have it for you today, but it should be a book that's on your shelf. No, I take it back. It should be a book that's on your coffee table or your nightstand because you're reading it regularly. It's an extremely important book. To begin with, Scopoli says, the very beginning of this work, that it is Quote, "It is therefore quite evident that all such persons are in great danger. For since the inward eye is darkened, by which they see themselves, and their outward actions, which are good, they attribute to themselves a high degree of perfection. And so, becoming more and more puffed up, they readily pass judgment upon others. Yet they themselves need a special miracle of grace to convert them, for nothing short of that would have effect. It is more easy to convert and bring back an open sinner to the path of truth than the man whose sin is hidden and mantled with the semblance of virtue. You clearly and distinctly see, then, from what I have said, that the essence of the spiritual life does not lie in any of those things to which I have alluded. It consists in nothing else but the knowledge of the divine goodness and greatness of our own nothingness and our proneness to evil, and the love of God and the hatred of self, and the entire subjugation not only to God himself, but for the love of him to all creatures, and giving and in completely resigning ourselves to the divine pleasure. Moreover, in willing and doing all this with no other wish or aim than the glory and honor of God and the fulfillment of his will, because it is his will, and because he deserves to be served and loved. And this is the law of love engraven on the hearts of his faithful servants by the hand of the Lord himself. This is the self-denial which is required of us. This is the sweet yoke and the light burden. I'll come back to that. This is that obedience to which our Redeemer and Master called us, both by word and by example. But if you aspire to such a pitch of perfection, you must daily do violence to yourself. And that's not what you initially would think there, right? Hopefully you get what he's saying. But if you aspire to such a pitch of perfection, you must daily do violence to yourself, as in that desire to that pitch of perfection, by courageously attacking and destroying all of your evil desires and affections. In great matters as well as in small, it is necessary then that you prepare yourself and hold yourself in readiness for this conflict, for he will be crowned who was brave in the battle. Doubtless this is the hardest of all struggles, because by fighting against ourselves, we are at the same time attacked by ourselves. And on that account, the victory obtained in such a conflict will be all others the most glorious and dear to God. Therefore, if you used every endeavor to mortify yourself and to tread down your inordinate affections, inclinations, and rebellious passions, even in the smallest matters, you would be rendering to God a far greater and more acceptable service than if, whilst permitting some of your inclinations to remain unmortified, you scourged yourself until you bled, fasted more rigorously, and practiced an austerity greater than that of the hermits and the saints, or converted souls by the thousands. For although in itself the conversion of souls is dearer to God than the mortification of an irregular desire, yet it is not your duty to will and perform that which is in itself more excellent, but that which God before all else strictly desires and requires of you. For he doubtless seeks and desires of you self-conquest, and through the mortification of your passions, rather than that you, willfully leaving some of them alive in you, should perform in some other direction some greater and more notable service for his sake. This is the self-denial which is required of us, willing and doing that which God desires for us. That is what we should always be striving for. But aspiring to such a pitch of perfection, you do violence to yourself by things that maybe you admire seeing in some of the example of the great saints. You could end up doing, while objectively for the right person, those things may be good. For you, there's certain, what we would say, smaller inclinations that remain unmortified that you just bypass as you're trying to reach these lofty heights of perfection. And so he says that in your quest of self-conquest and through the mortification of your passions, rather that you willfully leaving some of them alive should perform in some other direction some greater and more noticeable service for his sake. And the reason that that one hit me particularly hard, is because a few years ago I was teaching an RCIA class, And I had quite a bit of success with this RCIA class. And the the catechumens were coming in droves. At one point, it was like standing room only. Word had gotten out that this class that I had pretty much put together on my own was worthwhile to attend. And I had all of these people coming in, getting baptized and confirmed. And I was, in hindsight, I must have been a little bit puffed up. I always like to say that I was giving my due and glory to God and the work that He was doing through me. But there must have been something there, because when I consecrated, I did the St. Maximilian consecration to Our Lady. I have talked about my chronic illness on this channel before. I'm going to save that for my conversion story. But part of that what happened to me there was that I lost my RCIA class. And here 2 years later, I'm still kind of coming to terms with that. But when I read this the other day in preparation for this talk, it almost kind of teared me up a little bit, at least gave me chills, because I loved that class. I saw all of those people that came into the church through my efforts as my spiritual children whom I brought in. And reading what Scopoli said there, though, if you are converting souls by the thousands, but you have neglected your own spiritual needs and necessities, God does not take he he takes joy in the souls that are coming into the faith, but he does not take joy in the fact that you are neglecting yourself. And I kind of read that as, man, I might have been actually, and the illness has made me come to terms with things where I realized that there was parts of my life that I wasn't living spiritually as adequate as I should have been. And when I did that Marian consecration, you can see those videos. If you go back to the first videos I did on this channel, you will see me potentially on the road to perdition without having realized it. And then I got sick. And I don't think that God, nor the church, nor the saints, nor anybody of goodwill wants to see you or I bleeding and suffering. But the fact is, even as we think we are doing good, we are often being incredibly harmful to ourselves. And cauterizing that wound is going to hurt. But look, God doesn't call you to extreme penances. And I can guarantee you that most of you within the sound of my voice would benefit far greater from simple acts of fasting and almsgiving than you would by those higher acts of perfection that Scopoli is talking about there. And it's in these tiny steps that I think that you will find a better balance between the tendency that we have to go too far with things. Many of us, when we find out about the good that a disciplined penance can do for us, our souls want to immediately go ahead and throw on the hair shirts and get right at it. But none of the masters say that. Going all the way back to St. Paul, we need milk to begin with. And if you don't think that you do, you probably need it more than you think that you do. So hold off on the hair shirt for a moment. Don't buy your hair shirts off of Amazon right away. Rather, find a good confessor, find a good director. The director doesn't have to be a confessor. It helps if they are, but they don't have to be. And begin slowly. And that slowness is really all you need to achieve the ends for which you are called. The Lord will do most of the lifting for you. His yoke is light, as Scopoli referenced there, hearkening back to Christ himself saying, "My yoke is light." One thing, though, that I don't want any of you doing, if you take nothing else from this talk, heed this. Do not go out telling people that they're suffering, especially in the moment that they're experiencing it, that their suffering is somehow God's will. It's horrible pastoral advice. No one in the church recommends that you do that for others. No matter how much truth may be in it, it's not the time, and you are not the person to explain to them the in-depth discussions on theodicy while a person is actively suffering. Certainly don't go about giving them advice to take on more suffering, and hopefully none of you would do that. But at least try not to explain away a person's pain. The best thing a Christian can do in those moments is to try, in whatever capacity you can, to enter into and feel the person's suffering. No trauma bonding, to borrow from modern therapeutic language, that can be unhealthy in itself. But it is a human ailment to feel that no one else feels what you are feeling. Look, when I had my darker days, and I'm sure I will have more to come, the last thing I want is someone patronizing me or telling me it's going to be okay, or worse, saying that they want to give me the option to end my suffering. The greatest help I've ever received in those moments were from people who I believed felt the pain that I was feeling. If you take the word compassion and its roots and its etymological roots, passion derives from our Lord's suffering, and it means to suffer. It is a verb. We all think of passion as, oh, he was so passionate about this art. He loved art. He was passionate. To be passionate is to suffer over something. To be compassionate, from the Latin prefix com, means to with or together with. So compassion means together with suffering. Together with someone suffering, you are entering into it with them. Not only is this not sadistic, Catholic spirituality, when it is proper, I believe is the only therapy in quotes there, that offers solutions, as it allows you to enter into your brother's pain. And in some respects, by your suffering, by your taking on their suffering, help to heal them. Because in the end, all we're doing as Catholics is uniting all of our sufferings with the pain that our Lord felt on the cross. St. Paul says we make up for what is lacking. And those are some very bold words from St. Paul, as many, many theologians have noted over the years. But packed into them, I believe, is the answer. Catholic spirituality offers a way out by entering into. Cautiously, we don't advocate rashness. This is why discernment of the spirits is imperative. I would recommend, for those of you that haven't seen it, go watch Father John Brown's series on discernment of spirits. Christian Wagner has a channel called Distinguo, where they talk about discernment of spirits. We are called to enter into people's sufferings cautiously, but we need to work on our own spiritual. We need to refine our own mortifications first. With good directions, I believe that you could offer more spiritual alleviation of the pains that other people are feeling than many of your university trained therapists could ever hope to. Now, can there ever be a bridge between modern therapy practices and a more traditional Catholic mortification? Can that bridge be built? I like to think it could. We would have to step into the realm of modern therapy, though, and I do agree that there is a foundational, what am I looking here for? There's a foundational problem with modern therapy in terms of how it views suffering and what it views, in so much as it has a lack of a understanding of the human telos that is a loss for them in their own sense. So it's not going to be easy. But I think if we had some well-trained Catholic moral theologians who were out in the trenches instead of being in academia, where many of them seem to reside all of the time, we need more well-trained Catholic moral theologians out in the trenches fighting with us, because many of us are getting pounded and beaten down in the cultural wars out there. But I think it could be, because one of the things that I found in my journey through the chronic illness is that there are some cutting edge therapy that you see with certain doctors out there. And there's a book called Cured that was a very, very interesting book, in the sense that the doctor that wrote that book, there is an element that he acknowledges of healing that comes with belief. And not just like this vague notion of healing that you find in some like esoteric new age health spirituality stuff, but rather a true empirical recovery where when the mind believes it is being healed, the body responds in kind. And this is and will likely remain a very hard pill for the scientific world to swallow, because going back to the foundational problems that they would have to acknowledge, right, that they have spent the last 2 centuries telling people to trust them and not their faith. And meanwhile, they're actually finding evidence that faith heals. It's much more easy and lucrative for them to keep fueling and supplying the pharmaceutical chain. But there are a few people out there that are on the cutting edge of that. And I think there is room for Catholic moral theologians to step in and fill in the gaps of some of the good that may come out of modern therapy ideas and concepts, were they properly oriented towards the good of man, qua man, truly man in his telos. Because when we are placing trust in God, even if through the medium of a director, the so-called monkey mind can feel like it has to stop doing all the heavy lifting and instead turn to start relying on God. Yet we all need obedience in this process. And I think that is a major thing that's lacking in many Catholic circles in many ways, is this concept of obedience. And Americans were very independent, for those of you that are in other countries that may view this. Americans are stubbornly independent. To our own detriment, we would be independent. We're not asking, Catholics have never asked you to go out and wing this stuff on your own, or God forbid, listen to the advice of someone on YouTube. You need direct guidance from someone trained, or at least spiritually astute enough to know when to tell you to stop and to pull back from the things that, while it may be right for this person over there that you admire and want to imitate, it's not going to be right for you. And that's really, and I've repeated it several times here, that's my number one takeaway in all of this. And the question that arises whenever I've had this conversation with people is, okay, well, where then do I find this director, this guidance, this wisdom which you speak of? My only response to that is good luck. It's not easy, and you can even in your own way start to offer it up, as those old ladies used to say, as part of your mortification, the patience that you will need, and the delays that will happen, and the frustrations that you will feel. Read your scapoli and pray for God to provide for you, the director. I will say, and I was having this conversation with the lady up the street because I'm getting involved in the parish life of this new town that I'm living in. And we were having a conversation about supply and demand and some of the tricks of trying to get people involved in the church and the parish life and in the community. And I have quite a few ideas on that, though I think that some people are stuck in a situation or in a mentality where that if you just wait and if you wait and if you wait, eventually there will be a demand for these things. And I don't think that's the way that it works. And I didn't come up with this on my own. I was taught this by my own previous spiritual director, a priest. And when he took over as the first parish that he was assigned to, it was a traditional type of, modernly traditional type of parish where, for example, confession was only offered on Saturdays, 45 minutes before Mass. And there wasn't a really good confessional life in that parish, as I think many parishes are faced with right now. What Father Brian did, I just, excuse me, Father Brian, if you watch this, I'm sorry to throw your name out there like this, but that was a mistake. What this priest did was he started offering confessions before every single Mass that he said in this parish. And he said it took a long time. He started supplying it where there was no demand. He started supplying it. And I think he said it took about a year. He would sit in that confessional and nobody would show up for about a year. And he would stay there and he was offering the supply. But he said eventually it was like something just clicked. And now to this day, he's been assigned to a different parish. But the priest that took the parish after him has continued this practice. And there's every time you go to this church, it's the only kind of Novus Ordo normie kind of parish that I've ever been to, where every single time you go there, there's a long line to the confessional. because he created the supply, and the supply therefore created the demand. So this is my long way of saying that I think if there is enough of a demand, eventually the bishops would find ways to get access for spiritual directors for more of us. But I think that unfortunately the supply has to precede the demand. And I don't know if there's going to be any change in the approach that bishops are going to take. I've heard, and again, I talked to Father John Brown. If you go back and watch my interview with him on the Jesuits, the bishops are aware of this, at least according to what he was saying. And I think that them being aware of it, if they start to supply you'll see an increase in the demand. So just pray for these things. Unfortunately, as well, often many bishops wait until there is the demand before scrambling to add the supply if they ever do. And so then if rumor of this really good spiritual director in your neighborhood shows up, this person's going to be overwhelmed, right? So personally, I think that these things will change slowly in time, but these things take time, and that's kind of a topic for another day. So that is what I had for you today. No, no, I don't see anything. All right, guys. Well, if there's no questions, no thoughts, no concerns, no complaints, I will see you all next time. God bless. I hope you enjoyed this. Take care, everyone.